There are mistakes you make in haste, and there are mistakes you make in exhaustion, and then there are the rare and catastrophic ones you make when you are both. When your body has long since stopped consulting your mind and your hands are moving on their own, sorting through the quiet wreckage of a long day while the candle burns low and the house holds its breath around you. Tessa Lane made hers on a Thursday night in November, in the anteroom off the East Corridor, at 20 minutes past 1 in the morning. She did not know she had made it. That was, perhaps, the cruelest part. She tied the ribbon on the urgent correspondence folder, set it on the silver tray for first light delivery, climbed 2 flights of stairs to her narrow room, and slept, dreamlessly, completely, with the serene unconsciousness of a woman who had no idea she had just set fire to her entire life. She found out at 3 in the morning, when someone knocked on her door, not gently. To understand what Tessa had done, you must first understand what kind of week it had been. Ashford House had hosted a winter party for 7 days. 7 days of guests requiring things at unreasonable hours, of the housekeeper's careful schedule dissolving into improvisation, of every servant in the house moving at a pace that left no room for thought. Tessa had slept, on average, 4 hours a night. She had eaten standing up. She had smiled until her face ached and been invisible until her soul did. By Thursday, she was running on the particular fuel of the deeply depleted, that hollow, automated efficiency that looks like competence from the outside and feels from the inside, like operating a body that belongs to someone else. The correspondence sorting was the last task. She had done it dozens of times, incoming to the left, outgoing to the right, urgent documents in the red folder, personal correspondence held until morning. Her hands knew the choreography. Her eyes barely needed to supervise. She did not remember picking up her journal from the corner of the desk where she had left it 2 days before. She did not remember the letter sliding loose from between its pages. The letter she had written 6 nights ago in a fit of honesty she had immediately regretted. The one she had folded and tucked away with the firm intention of burning it at the first available opportunity. She did not remember her hand, automatic and unreasoning in its exhaustion, placing that loose page into the urgent folder, along with the estate bills and the land surveyor's report and the invitation responses. She remembered finishing. She remembered the ribbon, the tray, the stairs, the bed. She remembered waking 2 hours later with her heart already pounding before her mind had found the reason, reaching for her journal on the nightstand, opening it, and finding the letter gone. The cold that moved through her then was not the cold of the November air coming through the window she had forgotten to latch. It was the cold of complete and irreversible comprehension. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and went through every alternative, every possibility, every version of events in which she had not done what she had clearly done, and crossed them off, one by one, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had always been better at facing hard truths than hiding from them. The letter was in the urgent folder. The folder had been delivered at first light. It was now 3 in the morning, which meant that Benedict Sterling, the Duke of London, had been awake and working by lamplight, at an hour when most of the world was unconscious, as he often was, as she had known him to be, as she had in fact written about at considerable length in the very letter now sitting somewhere on his desk. 3 sharp knocks on her door. She stopped breathing. "Miss Lane." His voice, low, controlled, and absolutely certain it would be answered. Open the door. She had braced for the Duke. She had braced for the man she knew in daylight, composed, armoured, immaculate in his self-possession. The man who ran his household with the quiet authority of someone who had never once been told no and had long since stopped expecting it. She had braced for cold efficiency, for the flat, administrative tone he used when something had gone wrong and he was dealing with it, for the controlled, precise vocabulary of a man who had never in her memory allowed a feeling to arrive on his face uninvited. The man on the other side of the door was not entirely that man. His coat was gone. His cravat was gone. His white shirt was open at the throat, not carelessly, but as though he had reached for it as an afterthought. As though dressing fully at 3 a.m. had seemed, under the circumstances, beside the point. His dark hair had come slightly loose from its usual order, one strand fallen across his forehead in a way she had only ever seen once before, through a window when he had not known anyone was watching. His jaw carried the shadow of a late hour, and in his right hand, held with a particular tension she felt echoed in her own chest, was a piece of paper she recognized. Her handwriting, her words, her most private, most ungovernable, most thoroughly inadvisable self, folded and creased from being read. But the thing that undid her, the thing she had not prepared for, the thing no amount of bracing could have addressed, was his face, because it was not composed, not cool, not the efficient, economical blankness she had spent 3 years learning to read around the edges of. There was something alive in it, something moving behind those grey eyes like weather-crossing open water, complicated and fast and not entirely under his command. He was feeling something, and he was not hiding it, and that fact alone was so disorienting that for a moment she forgot to be terrified. He looked at her in the lamplight from the corridor, her with her hair unbound, her feet bare against the cold floor, her composure in absolute ruins. And for 3 full seconds, he did not speak. She watched his throat move as he swallowed. Then, I read it. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and she had never been the kind of woman who spoke just to fill silence, even terrible silence. Twice, he said, and something in the way he said it, the flatness of it, the lack of his usual precision, the word landing like something set down carefully rather than placed, told her he was not as controlled as he appeared, that the control was being applied in real time, actively, and at some cost. He looked down at the letter, the hand holding it tightened fractionally, his jaw shifted. "Phew, you wrote," he said, and now he was quoting her, softly, with a deliberateness that felt unbearably intimate, as though he had memorized it and was choosing each word back with care. "I think about you at hours, when I should be thinking about nothing." The silence between them was its own kind of sound. The house was asleep around them, and the corridor was dark except for the lamp he had carried, and the space between the door and where he stood was approximately 3 feet of the most charged air she had ever breathed. "Was it true?" he asked. She nearly laughed. It came out wrong, barely a breath, stripped of all humour, more like a small surrender. "I wrote it," she said. "That is not what I asked." She looked at him, properly, at the open shirt and the unguarded face and the letter held in a hand that was not entirely steady. She thought about lying. She thought about it seriously, with the full force of her self-preservation instinct, for approximately 2 seconds, and then she let it go, because she was Tessa Lane, and whatever else she was, whatever mistakes she made in the exhausted small hours of the morning, she had never been able to sustain a convincing performance of someone she was not. "Yes," she said, "all of it, every word." Something shifted in his face. She felt it the way you feel a door opening in a room you thought was sealed, a change in pressure, a movement of air, a sudden awareness of space that had not been there before. He did not move. He did not reach for her. But something in the careful architecture of his composure had moved on its foundation, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. "You wrote," he said, his voice lower now, "I am quite certain you have never once considered me as a woman." He looked up from the paper and met her eyes with a directness that cost him something visible. "You are wrong." She did not move. She was not sure she was capable of it. "You have been wrong about that," he said, "for considerably longer than you have been writing letters about it." He held her gaze for a moment, that stretched until she could feel it in her hands. Then he folded the letter, slowly, deliberately, as though it were something worth preserving, something he intended to keep, and put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest. "Pack a bag," Miss Lane. Small. Enough for a week. His voice had recovered its precision, but underneath it something new had taken up residence, something warm and irrevocable that had not been there before tonight. You will be accompanying me north, as my private secretary. We leave at dawn. She stared at him. The panic she had expected to feel had not arrived. In its place was something more bewildering, a strange, bright, terrifying thing that she could not yet name. That is my punishment, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved across her face with the slow, thorough attention of a man who had been waiting for permission to look and was not going to waste it now that he had it. That, he said, remains to be seen. He held her gaze for one more breath. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, his lamp casting long shadows, his footsteps measured and unhurried. The Duke again, almost, except for the letter in his pocket, pressed against his heart, that he did not give back. By morning, the decision had the quality of something dreamed, improbable, too vivid, already fading at the edges. But the bag at the foot of her bed was real. The travelling dress laid across the chair was real, and the dark carriage waiting in the frost-grey dawn below the servants. Entrance was emphatically, undeniably real. Benedict Sterling was already inside it when she climbed in. He did not look up from the document in his hands. He was the daylight Duke again. Coat, cravat, every button fastened, every edge of him returned to its usual precision. And if she had not been awake at 3 a.m, if she did not have the memory of an open shirt and an unsteady hand and a letter pressed to his chest stored in the very centre of her own, she might have believed the previous night had not happened at all. But she had. And she did. And when he finally looked up from his document and met her eyes across the carriage interior, something passed between them that had no name in any professional vocabulary either of them possessed. There is work to be done at Dunmore, he said. Correspondence, estate accounts, the quarterly reports for the Northern Holdings. You are capable. A pause. It is also a week in which neither of us is obligated to pretend the last 12 hours did not occur. He looked back at his document. I thought that preferable to the alternative. Tessa looked out the window at the city dissolving into frost-white countryside and thought that Benedict Sterling was, possibly, the most confounding man she had ever encountered, and that she was, almost certainly, in a great deal of trouble. The storm arrived without warning, as the worst ones always do. 1 hour north of the last posting town, the sky turned the colour of a bruise, and the wind came sideways off the moors, with a force that made the carriage shudder on its axles. The coachman managed another mile before the rear wheel found a rut deepened by the first rush of rain, and gave way with a crack that Tessa felt in her back teeth. They were 2 miles from the nearest shelter. Benedict looked out the window at the horizontal rain for a long, measuring moment, then at the coachman's assessment, then at the sky, then at Tessa, with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his rapid revision face. The expression of a man who had planned for every contingency except this one. There is an inn, the coachman said. The Crossed Keys, 1/4 mile on foot. The Crossed Keys was not the sort of establishment accustomed to dukes. It was small and low-ceilinged, and smelled powerfully of wood smoke and the kind of mutton stew that had been simmering long enough to become philosophical. The rushes on the floor were clean, but humble. The beams were low enough that Benedict had to duck through the main doorway, which he did without breaking stride, as though inconvenient architecture was simply another thing the world required him to manage. The woman behind the counter looked at his coat, the quality of it, the cut of it, the very particular way it sat on a man who had never in his life bought anything that was not the best available, with the practiced suspicion of someone who had learned that well-dressed strangers invariably cost more than they were worth. 1 room left, she said. Double. Take it or leave it. The silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to for both of them to understand the situation completely. Benedict placed his hand flat on the counter. We'll take it, he said. with the smooth decisiveness of a man who had assessed the alternatives and found them wanting. And then, in a tone so level it was almost conversational, "My wife and I are grateful for it." Tessa did not flinch. She had been in service long enough to understand the arithmetic of the situation. A duke and his unmarried maid, one room, a storm, an inn full of people with long memories and longer tongues. And she produced a smile of such practiced serenity that the innkeeper's suspicion softened by several degrees. She said nothing. She did not need to. She had been performing composure professionally for years. The room was small. The fire, already laid and burning, was genuinely good. There was one armchair positioned near the hearth, one bed against the far wall, and a window through which the storm pressed against the glass with the insistent energy of something that had nowhere else to be. Benedict stood in the centre of the room after the innkeeper's girl had gone, and looked at the single chair and the single bed with an expression of such carefully maintained neutrality that Tessa very nearly smiled. "I'll take the chair," he said. "You are a foot taller than the chair," she said. "I've managed worse." She looked at him, at the Duke of London preparing to spend a night folded into an armchair half his size, with his dignity entirely intact, as though this were merely another logistical problem. And something in her chest did something warm and inconvenient. "Benedict," she said. His name, simply. The way she had said it once before, in the corridor, to see what it did to him. It did the same thing it had done then. Something in him went very still, not the controlled stillness she knew from daylight, but a different kind, the stillness of a person absorbing something that has reached them without armor. "The bed is large enough for 2 people to sleep in it, without touching," she said carefully. "It would be absurd for you to spend the night in a chair." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are remarkably practical," he said finally. "I am remarkably tired," she said. "And you are remarkably tall. Sit in the chair if you want, but I am going to sleep." She did not wait for his answer. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the pins from her hair, and she was aware, without looking, that he sat in the armchair, and that he opened the estate accounts he had managed to rescue from the carriage, and that he did not read them. "You're not reading that," she said, after a while. "I am reviewing the Northern tenancy figures. You've been on the same page for 20 minutes. A pause. The fire popped. The storm leaned harder against the glass. He set the papers down and looked at her, the way he had looked at her from the doorway at 3 in the morning, the way she suspected he had been looking at her for 3 years when she wasn't watching. And the firelight made his face do something she had only seen glimpses of before. It made him look like the man underneath the Duke, quieter, more uncertain, more real. "Tell me something true," he said, "something you have never told anyone." She considered him for a moment. The fire, the storm, the small warm room that existed outside, every rule that governed both their lives. She thought about being careful and decided, for once, not to be. "I used to think I wanted nothing," she said, "that wanting things was a luxury I couldn't afford. I trained myself out of it very young. It's easier when you're in service, when everything you are belongs to someone else's household. You learn to need less, to expect less, to find the small satisfactions and be content with them." She looked at the fire. "And then I came to Ashford House, and you made it very difficult to want nothing." The silence after that had a different quality from all the silences before it. Fuller, like a room that has just had all its windows opened. He got up from the chair. She tracked him in her peripheral vision without turning her head. The movement of him across the small room, unhurried, deliberate. The same quality of movement he had when he had decided something and was implementing it. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed, not close enough to touch, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him across the inches between them, could hear him breathe, could feel the particular gravity of proximity to someone you have wanted from a careful distance for a very long time. "Your turn," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm made itself entirely at home. And I have been, he said slowly. The thing people expected of me for so long that I am no longer entirely certain where that ends and I begin. He looked at his hands. I was told, young, that a sterling does not want visibly, does not need publicly, manages, performs, maintains. A pause. I became very good at it. Too good, she said. Yes. He looked at her then, sideways, with something that might have been rueful. And then you looked at me down the east corridor, as though I were a problem to be assessed. And something that I had been managing for a very long time became considerably harder to manage. She held his gaze. The fire between them, the literal one, the one in the hearth, made everything warmer and more honest than it was permitted to be in daylight. He reached out slowly, giving her every possible moment to move away, and covered her hand with his. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and still and impossibly careful, like something offered rather than taken. I know, he said. And she understood, from the weight of those two words, that he was not just answering her. He was arriving somewhere he had been walking toward for 3 years, and he knew it, and he was not pretending otherwise. They stayed like that for a long time, his hand over hers, the storm outside, the fire between them, while the world beyond the crossed keys went on without them, and neither of them moved to reclaim the distance they had spent so long maintaining. They reached Dunmore the following afternoon, the roads passable again under a sky washed clean by the storm. The estate was smaller than Ashford, wilder, less managed, the kind of property that revealed its owner's private self rather than his public one. There were books stacked in unconventional places. The gardens had been allowed to grow with a certain deliberate freedom. The staff, fewer in number and longer in tenure, greeted their duke with a warmth that told Tessa something about him she had not known. He was different here, more complete, as though Ashford House required him to perform a version of himself, and Dunmore simply permitted him to be it. On the third evening, they ate together by the library fire. Benedict told her the truth, how the watching had begun that October morning in the corridor, how he had sent the broth because he could not think of a single legitimate reason to come himself, how the letter had not shocked him because he had spent months already noticing everything. And I wrote 4 pages about that broth, she told him. Something crossed his face, brief and warm and involuntary. He laughed, quietly, but actually, it transformed him so completely that she felt the breath leave her. I know, he said. I read them. He leaned forward across the table, the firelight between them, his eyes finding hers with an attention that was nothing like the Duke of London, and everything like the man who had sat beside her in a storm with his hand over hers. He said her name, softly, and the door opened. A footman with an urgent message. The moment dissolved, but it had existed, and they both knew it. Lord Harwick arrived the following morning without invitation, with the specific energy of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted from the world without troubling himself about prior ownership. He was a neighbour. His estate bordered Dunmore to the east, and he called on Benedict with the ostensible purpose of a boundary dispute that had been generating paperwork for 2 years and resolution for none. But Harwick's attention did not stay on Benedict. "Your secretary," he said, his eyes moving over Tessa with the appraising efficiency of a man who catalogued women the way others catalogued horseflesh. "Miss Lane manages my correspondence," Benedict said. Level, but underneath it, very still. Charming. Harwick moved toward her. "I've been looking for someone with that capability myself. Perhaps when Sterling no longer requires your services, she won't." Benedict had moved. He was simply, suddenly, between her and Harwick, not touching her, not dramatic about it, just present in the way that a wall is present, inevitable and complete. His voice was controlled, but underneath the control was something she had never heard from him before, something raw and absolute and not remotely interested in being polite about it. "Miss Lane's position at Ashford House is permanent," he said. She is not available for other arrangements. She is not a resource to be discussed or acquired. And I would strongly suggest, Harwick, that you adjust your manner of address before I do it for you. Harwick recovered his smile, though it cost him. He took the boundary survey and left without lingering. In the silence after the door closed, Tessa looked at the set of Benedict's shoulders, the tension releasing, slowly, now that the performance of control was no longer required, and felt something move through her chest that was larger and warmer and more irrevocable than anything she had put in 3 years of letters. "Permanent," she said. He turned. "Yes. I am not interested," she said carefully, "in being anyone's permanent arrangement." He took a step toward her. Something in his face had gone quiet and certain, the way it did when he had decided something. "Good," he said. "I'm not offering an arrangement." They returned to Ashford House on a grey Friday afternoon, the week measured behind them in the particular way that weeks measure themselves when something irreversible has occurred inside them. Not by days, but by moments, stacked and weighted and impossible to unknow. Nothing formal had been said. Nothing had been named. They had held that careful, suspended space between what existed and what had not yet been spoken. Both of them, she suspected, for reasons that were not identical but arrived at the same caution. She because she had spent 3 years learning not to want things she could not afford. He because he was Benedict Sterling, and naming a thing made it real, and real things could be lost. The house received them with its usual ordered efficiency. The staff moved, the rooms were prepared. Everything was exactly as it had always been, and nothing was. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her room, her own room, her narrow room, the correct room, and listened to the house settle around her and tried, with the methodical discipline she had spent years developing, to be reasonable, to make an accounting of the situation, to weigh what she felt against what was possible, and arrive at a sensible conclusion. The conclusion she arrived at, after an hour of effort, was that she was in love with Benedict Sterling. She had been, she thought, for quite some time. She had simply been calling it other things. She was still examining this conclusion with the bleak thoroughness of someone inspecting a problem they cannot solve when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She knew them. She had known them for 3 years. The particular cadence of them, the way they landed on the upper floorboards, measured and certain and never in a hurry. She tracked them the way you track something you have been listening for without admitting it. Down the corridor, slowing, stopping outside her door. A knock, softer than the first time, asking rather than demanding. She opened the door. He stood in the dark corridor with no lamp this time, just the faint silver light from the window at the end of the hall edging his face, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not unguarded exactly, but stripped, all the careful layering of the Duke of London removed, and underneath it, just a man who had walked down a hallway in the dark because he could not think of a single good reason not to. "I have been trying," he said, "to be sensible about this." "How is that going?" she asked. "Badly," he said, "for approximately 3 years." She stepped back from the door. Not far, just enough. He came inside. What happened next was not hasty. It was not the frantic thing of people who have been waiting and can no longer wait. It was slower than that, and more deliberate, weighted with the particular gravity of 2 people who understand what they are choosing and are choosing it anyway, with full knowledge of the cost, full awareness of the morning approaching, and the kind of certainty that does not require everything to be settled in advance. He kissed her first at the side of her jaw, just below her ear, where the faint lamplight from the hall caught the line of her neck. Tentative, questioning, barely a breath. She answered him by turning her face toward his, until the question became something else entirely. She had imagined this. She was honest enough to admit it. In the dark pages of letters she had written for no one. She had wondered what it would be like to be seen by him, not as a useful pair of hands, not as a capable member of the household machinery, but as herself, as a woman. She had imagined his composure holding. She had not imagined the way it dissolved, layer by layer, incrementally, like ice that has been warm from underneath for a long time. And she had not imagined the man it revealed underneath, less controlled, more present, more uncertain than she had expected, and more tender for it. He said her name once, quietly, against her hair, just her name, with everything in it that he had never said any other way. Afterward, he did not go. He sat on the edge of her narrow bed with his forearms resting on his knees, his head slightly bowed, looking at the middle distance with an expression she recognized, the one he wore when he was feeling something that exceeded his vocabulary. She sat beside him. The house breathed around them. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and went silent. "I know what you're thinking," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she read him now with a clarity that had not been available to her before tonight. The grey eyes, all the complicated weather behind them. "Tell me," he said. "You're thinking about the morning," she said. "About what this makes you, what it makes me, what the world will say about both of us, and whether you have the right to ask me to withstand it." A long, full pause. "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I am not a woman who needs protecting from the world, Benedict. I have been managing the world's opinion of me my entire life." She paused. "What I need to know is whether you intend to face it with me or simply feel badly about exposing me to it." Something moved across his face, something that settled into resolution. The way a man's expression settles when he has stopped deliberating and arrived at the thing he was going to do all along. He reached out and took her hand. The same deliberate, careful gesture as the inn, as the storm, as all the beginnings that had led here. Held it without speaking for a long moment. "With you," he said, without question, without negotiation. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it as though it were something he intended to keep. "I have been sensible for a very long time, Tessa. I find I have very little interest in it anymore." Lady Miriam Sterling found out on a Wednesday, and she came to Tessa first. She was a woman constructed entirely from consequence, from the awareness of it, the management of it, and the absolute conviction that reputation was a responsibility to be maintained with the vigilance one applied to a leaking roof in winter. She loved her nephew in the way of people who love the idea of a person more than the person themselves. Consistently, and without flexibility. "I will not see his title dragged through scandal," she said, in a voice from which every warm thing had been removed. "Leave by the end of the week. There is a reference inside, generous, and enough money to establish yourself somewhere. The Sterling name will not follow you." She set the envelope on the table. "He will be angry. He will recover. Men always do." Tessa looked at the envelope. She thought about Benedict's voice in the dark, saying, "With you," without question. She thought about his hand over hers in the storm. She thought about what it would cost him, the title, the standing, the 40 years of family name, to be seen choosing her. She took the envelope. She told herself it was the right thing. She packed her bag before she could think clearly enough to stop herself, and she left before dawn. He found out at 7 in the morning. The housekeeper handed him Tessa's note, with the pale expression of a woman delivering news she had not chosen to carry. Brief, careful prose, stripped down to what she believed she was permitted to leave. She was sorry. She was grateful. She wished him well. Not a single word that was not true, and not a single word of what was most true. He read it once, set it on the desk. He stood at the window, the same window, the frost-covered garden, the view he had been standing at 3 years ago when she had walked in without knocking and seen his face before he had time to arrange it. And he was very still for a long moment. 90 seconds, perhaps less. Then he called for his horse. His aunt intercepted him in the entrance hall, already dressed for a conversation she had rehearsed. "Benedict," she began, with the measured authority of a woman who had been managing the men of this family since before he was born. He stopped. He looked at her. Not the Duke's look, not composed and administrative and politely immovable. A different look, the look of a man who has finished deliberating and is no longer available for further input on the subject. "As if you go after her," Lady Miriam said. "If you do this publicly, there is no recovering it. The title, I know," he said. "Then you understand what you are." "I know, Miriam," quietly, finally, "and I find that I no longer care." He walked out the door into the November morning. She had 3 hours on him, and she had taken the coaching road south. He rode at a pace that his horse would remember, through mud and mist and the cold particular, to mornings that have not yet decided whether to clear. And he did not think about the scandal or the title, or the drawing rooms of London assembling their opinions. He thought about a note on a desk. He thought about a woman who had taken the envelope because she believed, wrongly, that he needed protecting from his own choices. He found her 2 miles from the first posting town. She was on foot. The coach had lost a horse to lameness, and she had walked on rather than wait, because she was Tessa Lane, and waiting for a problem to resolve itself had never been her way. She was walking in the rain with her bag on her shoulder and her chin level and her hair coming loose in the wet, and she looked, from a distance, like exactly what she was, a woman who had made a decision she believed was right and was implementing it with everything she had, even though it was destroying her. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of hooves on the wet road, slowing, stopping. She turned. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He was soaked through, his coat dark with rain, his hair wet, the immaculate precision of the Duke of London entirely abandoned to the November weather. And he stood in the road and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The rain came down between them, steady and indifferent. And Tessa looked at this man, this impossible, infuriating, brilliant man who had ridden through mud in a ruined coat to stand in a public road in the rain, and felt something enormous move in her chest. "You should go back," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of her voice. "No, your aunt is wrong," he said. He took a step toward her. The mud pulled at his boots. He did not appear to notice. About what matters? About what I am willing to lose? Another step. Closer now. Close enough that she could see the rain on his face, the set of his jaw, the look in his eyes that she recognized from the doorway at 3 in the morning. Unguarded, unhidden, absolutely certain. I have spent my life being sensible about things that did not deserve my sensibility. I have been careful and correct, and I have maintained every expectation placed on me since I was old enough to understand what was expected. And I have been... He stopped. Something moved across his face, something raw and unpolished that she had never seen the Duke of London allow in public, and that this man, standing in the rain on a public road, was making no effort to conceal. For a very long time, profoundly, quietly, impeccably unhappy. She stared at him. The rain ran down her face. She did not wipe it away. "You are the only thing in my life," he said, "that has ever made me want something more than I wanted to be safe." "Benedict, I know what it costs," he said. "I have been calculating the cost since the East Corridor 3 years ago. I know exactly what it costs, Tessa, and I am standing in the rain telling you that I have made the calculation and I don't care." He was in front of her now, close. Rain between them and nothing else. "You took that envelope because you thought you were protecting me. You were wrong. I do not need protecting from a life that has you in it. I need protecting from a life that doesn't." She looked at him for a long, suspended moment, at the wet coat and the ruined boots, and the face that was not performing anything, not managing anything, not maintaining any distance whatsoever, and felt 3 years of careful, protected wanting come entirely loose from its moorings. "You are standing in the rain," she said, "in the middle of a public road. Yes. Anyone could see you. Good." He said it simply, without hesitation, without the flicker of a man who has considered the consequences and found them manageable, just good, as though being seen was, in fact, the point. Let them. She dropped her bag. She closed the distance between them. Not slowly, not carefully, but with the directness of a woman who has spent 3 years being measured about this and has nothing left to be measured about. And when he pulled her in, with the certainty of a man who had ridden 2 miles in the rain and was not letting go, she stopped pretending that she wanted him to. They stood in the road in the rain for a long time. The horse waited with patient indifference. The road was empty in both directions, and Benedict Sterling, the Duke of London, held Tessa Lane in the mud and the wet with his face in her hair and his arms around her with a completeness that had nothing to do with dukes or maids or the careful maintenance of social architecture, and everything to do with 2 people who had been waiting, in their different ways, for a very long time. Society, as it always does, had opinions. They were loud and various, and delivered with the energetic conviction of people who consider other people's lives a form of public entertainment. There were predictions of catastrophe. There were declarations of disgrace. There were whispered conversations in drawing rooms from which the name Sterling emerged in tones ranging from scandal to pity to, in a few notable cases, something that sounded very much like admiration. Benedict Sterling was spectacularly uninterested in all of it. He announced the engagement in December, brief, direct, in the same economical language he applied to everything, as though marrying his former lady's maid was simply the most logical conclusion to a set of circumstances he had examined and found entirely satisfactory. A notice in the Times, a letter to his solicitor, a conversation with his household staff that was warmer and longer than anyone had expected, and that said, among other things, that Miss Lane was not changing her name in the staff records because she was no longer going to be in them. The wedding was small. The church was cold. Tessa wore the deep blue wool she had always loved, practical and warm and entirely herself. And she walked down the aisle with her chin level and her eyes clear and the particular composure of a woman who has made her peace with wanting what she wants and has stopped apologizing for it. He watched her walk toward him with the expression she had learned to read by now, the one he wore when something had exceeded his vocabulary. He took her hand when she reached him. "You're not going to say something impossibly composed, are you?" she murmured. "I was considering it," he said. That smile, the real one, the brief and transforming one. "Tessa, I have been composing the appropriate thing to say to you since approximately the 2nd week of your employment. I have had 3 years." A pause. "The appropriate thing is that you have made every inadvisable decision I have ever made feel, in retrospect, like the best thinking I have ever done." She looked at him for a moment. Then she squeezed his hand. "That," she said, "is the most Benedict Sterling thing you have ever said to me." The smile lasted longer this time. The vicar, who had been waiting with professional patience, cleared his throat. They were married on a cold December morning in a small church, with snow beginning outside the windows. And in the breast pocket of his coat, the left side against his heart, he carried a folded piece of paper, her handwriting, her words. The letter she had never meant to send, that had changed everything. He had kept every one she had ever written. She found this out later, on a quiet evening in the Dunmore Library, opening a drawer she had not opened before. They were there, all of them, in order, tied with a piece of dark ribbon, and she stood for a long moment looking at them, at 3 years of her most private self, preserved in a drawer by the only person she had ever sent them to by accident. She did not say anything to him about it until later, when the fire had burned low and the house was quiet, and he was reading beside her with the particular ease of a man who has stopped managing his own happiness and simply allowed it. "Mais, you kept them," she said. He did not look up from his book, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, fractionally, with the warmth of a man who has been found out in something he is not sorry for. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. At this man she had written about for 3 years before she had ever been allowed to know him. At the fire on his face and the book in his hands and the small, complete, entirely inadvisable life they had built in the space where the rules used to be. "Good," she said. And that was that. That is the story of Tessa Lane and Benedict Sterling, Duke of London, the maid who wrote letters she never intended to send, and the man who rode through the rain to tell her, in the middle of a public road, that she had been wrong about being invisible. If you are still here, you already know what I need from you. Leave a comment with the moment that broke you, the broth, the open shirt at 3 a.m, the rain, the drawer full of letters. I need to know I am not alone in this. And if you want more stories like this one, more impossible men and the women who refuse to be invisible to them, you know where to find me. Until next time.